Okay, I think we have uh, achieved quorum, so I'll get started. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ashish Kohli from Penn State University, and I'm going to be the host for this keynote from Kathryn McKinley. And this presentation is going to be about how to develop a research mindset, right? So before we get started with the keynote, I'll take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about the workshop that we are conducting and present a few logistics about this session. And then I'll introduce Kathryn to everybody. She doesn't really need an introduction, but I'll do it nonetheless. And then I'll let Kathryn take it from there. Okay, so this keynote, this is the second keynote as part of the Young Architect workshop. This is a workshop that we started last year, and this is the second version of this workshop with the aim of providing mentoring opportunities for early career computer architecture PhD students. So as part of the workshop, we have these keynotes. We also have a panel on demystifying grad school. And we also have student presentations where they present their own research. These are now being hosted on YouTube. And we also have one-on-one mentoring sessions for students with established computer architects. So you can find all of these details about the workshop on our website. And then when it comes to Kathryn, one quick thing about the talk. So during the talk, if you have any questions, please type them out in the chat box. So if you go to the bottom of the window, you should see a menu of options that Zoom provides. And in that, there is a chat function. So please use that. And Kathryn will answer your questions at an appropriate time. Okay, so when it comes to Kathryn, she, like we all know, she's a prolific researcher who has worked on various topics in computer systems, ranging from programming languages, compilers, operating systems, computer architecture, cloud systems, runtime systems. Basically, you name it, and she's like worked on those topics, and mainly with a focus on improving performance, exploiting parallelism, and working on memory systems as well. She has developed numerous software systems that are available to all of us, and they're widely used in both industry and academia. She has won a number of Test of Time awards, Best Paper awards, micro topics, research highlights, like a lot of prestigious awards in computer science research. She is also a fellow of both IEEE and ACM. And one cool thing that I didn't know about Kathryn was that she has been invited to testify in front of the House Committee on Science. So I think that is pretty cool. And the other thing that I didn't know about Kathryn, I guess, is that she's a fan of Michael Jordan. So that makes it at least two of us. And with that, I'll let you take it from here, Kathryn.
Thanks for the nice introduction. So I'm going to be talking today about how you think about yourself and setbacks, and really more on the emotional and strategic side of research rather than any specific research topic. And I haven't given this talk before, so please, be gentle with me, but also I'm open to feedback, because if this kind of talk is useful and you have ways to improve it, I'm also interested in that. So a little bit more about me. I have 3 sons and 1 husband, so 2 of 4 good men in this picture. That's my oldest son, and my youngest son and I in Montana in January. And research-wise, I'm most known for garbage collection, that's the garbage can, and research methods, so the da capo benchmarks and how you do benchmarking of managed languages and evaluations. So my job now is inventory and engineering efficiency of Google Cloud systems. And I'd be happy to talk about that a lot. And I got that really warm introduction with lots of my successes in it. But I want you to notice that my CV does not include all my failures. And how you respond to obstacles and failures and how I've responded to these things really have defined my success, but you never see that. And I developed this, like, here's my list of failures slide when I started getting introduced, and I was embarrassed by my introductions, and they did not follow my personal narrative about how things had gone. So I want to give one quick example in this space is that when I came up for tenure, I got tenure. My most cited paper at that point was my first ASPOS paper, which was about loop transformations for improving data locality. And that paper was rejected from bad conferences, and I learned from the paper rejections on that paper. One of the things I did was I moved related work into the second section. So there was never any question or getting tired in terms of defining what differentiated this paper from the related work. And that was an important aspect of strategy of getting papers accepted at top conferences. And so, so this talk is mostly about how to respond to when things don't go well and how to think about yourself and manage yourself. So if you don't remember anything else, these are the 4 things that I want you to take away from this talk. And none of these things are something you can do tomorrow and check off a box and you're done, okay? These are things that you have to do every single day to keep growing and keep improving and keep enjoying your job. And so here are my 4 lists of having a research mindset. Say to yourself, I will examine and counter my biases. I will learn from my failures in terms of tech strategies for dealing with them and turning them into successes. But I will also learn emotional resilience so that when I have failures, I don't fall into a depressed heap. And then I will learn, because learning is part of innovating, and then I will innovate in my technical area. And I think these, in order to do number 4, I think you need 1, 2, and 3. So, and I'll give you an example of how my mindset, how I do these things in my mindset and strategies, and then I'll talk about each of these components. And so for bias, I'm not really talking about, we often think about gender bias or racial bias and people bias. I'm not really talking about that here, although that is part of it. What I'm talking about is idea bias. So Mark Hill says something in the previous keynote, because he's super famous and smart, you think, of course he's right. And you just assume whatever he said is correct, and you don't try to push deeper. So that's the kind of bias I'm talking about counteracting. And as my introduction pointed out, I like to work on a lot of different areas. And so, but classic problems, performance is the key to most of my work, sometimes programmability. And so that drives me in terms of, these are classic problems that never go out of style, but I don't limit myself to solutions only in the architecture space or only in the programming space. I try to find the hammer that's actually good for this particular nail, rather than saying, here's my hammer, here's my approach, and I'm going to apply it to everything. So that's the way I counter my bias. My bias is to solve programming language problems and runtime systems problems, because I know how to do that fairly well at this point in my career. But the right solution may not be that. So I try to counter that bias. So that's an example of what I mean by countering your bias. So in research, you're always going to have setbacks, okay? So one of the things I do is I don't wait for external feedback to identify when things go badly. For example, when we pull a paper right before the deadline, or we submit it, but we know that we didn't do our best on it. So I try to say, okay, let's examine what went wrong and try not to do whatever it was that we did wrong before. And then when things go badly, for example, when I failed my qualifying exams and when I had papers rejected, I recognize that I'm not going to feel happy about those things, and I let myself wallow, and depending on like my general mood, whatever, I limit that to some number of days that I get to feel sad about it. And then I change my mindset. I say, okay, what am I going to do next to like the next paper deadline or the next grant deadline? And what should I learn about what just happened in terms of what I didn't present, like ideas I didn't explain well, or I didn't prepare well enough to give this talk, for example, perhaps. And so I judge myself, or someone is judging me inadequate, but I only feel sad about that for a fixed amount of time. And then I have to change my mindset to say, how am I going to respond so that I make this into a success? What am I going to do next? And start focusing on that, what I'm going to do next. So every time I think, oh, my paper got rejected from ASPLOS, that makes me sad. Instead, I'm saying, okay, it got rejected, but I'm doing X, Y, and Z, so it gets accepted to ISCA, for instance. And then don't just listen to the feedback directly, try to synthesize what they're saying. So if someone thinks that this isn't an important problem and that you shouldn't be working on it, well, maybe that's true. Or maybe you just didn't explain well enough why this is an important problem. You didn't have enough examples. So you have to take the feedback and think about it critically and generalize it rather than slate, like, oh, they said they didn't like this graph. Oh, well, maybe you should delete it, but maybe you should instead explain it better. Like, so you can't just take what the feedback says directly. You have to try to think about it more strategically. And then I have a set of advisors who anything I'm really struggling with, I go ask for advice. So most of you know that I've now collaborated with Steve Blackburn for 21 years. And so he's definitely one of my advisors. Margaret Martinosi and I are actually meeting once a month right now to do some peer coaching as she starts her new job, and I have a very challenging job and have things that I want to work on to improve. So that's, and then we talk about the meta parts of research at that meeting. So having trusted people you can talk to and talking about this meta-ness is important. All right, and then managing my emotions. So I really need to exercise every single day, or I don't feel very happy. I need to sleep well, I need to eat well, and I need some time with my family. And that seems like, oh, you're filling up your day with other things that aren't work. And yes, that's true. And if I don't do enough of that, then when bad things happen, I feel bad. All right. And so these are super important to me. I've debugged myself. I really do exercise every day or I feel badly. And I fit that in, and then I'm nicer to you and my husband and my children. So for creativity, I need to create unscheduled time. And I need to read a lot and think critically about the things I read. So that's kind of my blueprint. It went on a little longer than I thought it should. So let's talk about you now. So what I'd like you to do, what we would have done if we were in person is you would have discussed with a partner this thing. But now I'm going to give you 1 minute to write down or type a recent creative idea. What were the circumstances? When, where, why did you think you were creative? And then circumstances under which you don't feel creative. All right, go. Please write down. All right, that's been a minute. And let's, even if you aren't finished, let's come back together. And instead of reporting back out right now, we're going to have a chance to, you can type in and we can report out a little bit later. So what's next is, now I'm going to go through 3 different concepts. I'm going to spend the most time on flexible optimism for perseverance. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time right now on cognitive bias and creativity. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about growth mindset, which is a way of thinking about learning and understanding stuff that builds on flexible optimism. And so that's why I'm going to spend the most time on that. And then we'll do these reflections and we'll have some time for discussion and questions at the end. All right, so what is bias? Bias is a pattern of judgment which humans need to function. And at the same time, it can lead to illogical conclusions. So we really need to be able to generalize and memorize stuff and just do it that way all the time. So my joke is, if you have to think about where your underwear is, it's going to be a bad day. Because you just need to have some things that are totally automatic in your life, or you're spending too much cognitive load figuring out like how to drive to work. You drive to work or walk to work or take your bike to work or whatever you do. You want to do it the same way every time, so you're not having to really think hard and make a big plan, everything else. So, but once you do that, then and you can generalize about ideas and people and other things. And so once you do that, then you can get to illogical conclusions just because you're using that generalization that you have and you're applying it in places you shouldn't be applying it. So some of the ways that people talk about bias is that these are processes in your brain and it's difficult to distinguish when you have them and when you don't. So you're using shortcuts like a generalization, like the top drawer of my dresser always has my underwear in it. So when I've moved a lot in my life, had a bunch of different places I've worked, like where's the dresser? Like I need to find that. Where's the drawer? I need to find that. So that is, that lets you do things quickly, all right? And then you have mental noise, which is just random things that come into your head, or maybe someone says, today we're gonna put the dishes someplace else, things like that, that just distract you. And so you have limited information processing capacity, so you wanna use your creativity and not on some things, but on other things. And so then you need to limit that, okay? And then when you see a problem, you might have emotional and moral motivations that cause you to view it one way, or you might be influenced because I said it and you're influenced by me, or you might be opposite. Just because I said it, you might say, oh, I don't believe anything Kathryn says, so I'm going to discount it. So that's not logical because not everything I say is true and not everything I say is false. So you really need to be considering the context and stepping back from your social influence, which, for example, is authority or famous person or person you admire, that they say something and so then you want to believe it. So there are a lot of example biases, so I'm not going to go through all of these, but they're on the slide and you can look up some of these. One I've talked about already is authority bias, because someone you feel admiration to or has an authority in your community or in your life, like your research advisor, that you're biased to believe them. One of the interesting ones is how people frame, and very related to computer science research, is framing problems. So when someone states a problem a certain way, it implies a solution a certain way. So often just reframing problems, like trying to think about operating systems for intermittent computing, for example, or or programming languages so that more people could program. So these are examples of reframe, like most programming languages were designed for expert programmers and making them effective. So if you reframe the question, you often come to different answers. And so these are the kinds of approaches a researcher can take to expose to themselves and to everybody else what different ways of thinking about problems, and also freeing up your mind to not solve problems the same way or just do an incremental solution on something that someone else has already done. So another thing that I like, and I find that I have a problem with, is if something's really surprising or unusual, you tend to remember it more than all the boring results that were in the paper, okay? And maybe, or in something you read. And that is called like a von Restorff effect, and it's remember surprises. But surprises aren't usually the most general result that you get, so that's one thing you could think about. And then the Dunning-Kruger effect is also interesting, especially as you consider your status as a new researcher. For students, is you might overestimate your expertise, whereas someone in my position who's worked on a problem for a long time thinks, oh, I still have plenty to learn. So I find that an interesting and counterintuitive bias. All right, so these are just examples of how your brain is gonna work, okay? And you have stereotypes and survivor bias, like because people are still there in the field, you think in order to be like them, those are more the personal biases. All right, so what you wanted, one of the things that can help is to examine when you read a paper or when you're thinking about doing something next, what biases does the paper show, and how can you think out of this bias box in terms of understanding when you're like, you have the curse of knowledge because you can only think about something the way you think about it for a long time. So this slowing down and examining as a researcher, super important to examine where you're coming from and try to think of another angle. And so how do you do this? You practice, okay? So one of the things I did when I was a professor and teaching research classes was read, when we read a paper, okay, think like you're that researcher. What would you do next if you wrote this paper and you wanted to write the next paper? So what's the incremental idea, or what's the experiments you didn't do that could be improving on the paper that you did? All right, and then think like, what is a completely different approach to solving the same problem, okay? And then do that every time you read a paper, and you'll start thinking outside this bias box. So that's just an example, and that's a trained way to think about problems, all right? So this slow down and examine your biases is an approach that in the popular literature is now called thinking fast and thinking slow. So if you're an expert in an area, your first response is often a really good one. But if you slow down and think about stuff, that will help you get outside this bias box. So there's some interesting research that says this doesn't really work on people, but I feel there's a mix of that. So one of the things that we do at Google when we do performance evaluation of people is we remind everybody at the beginning. So here are some biases that you could have. You could have recency bias. So somebody does something really good like this month and you give them a lot of credit for it, whereas someone who did something good 2 months ago or 3 months ago, because it's more distant in the past, you give them less credit for it. So that's an example of reminding you of what biases you might have. You might be biased for or against women. So when we're doing the evaluations, try to think about if that's influencing you or not. And I personally find it useful. The research says maybe it works or maybe it doesn't. All right. So now we're going to do one more minute of thinking about your creativity. And this time I want you to write down, was overcoming bias a factor in your creativity? Of the example that you used, and then are other circumstances, when you think about when you're least creative, are other circumstances holding you back? And I'll give you a minute to write that down. And then I'd like people who feel comfortable, please share out in the text. And I can't see the text while presenting. So Ashish, can you read them out in 1 minute from now? Okay, you're on mute now.
I'll do that, yes.
Okay, thank you. So now please write down your reflections. You have 1 minute.
Kathryn, there are a couple of questions.
Okay.
In the chat box. So do you want to answer them after we are done with the 1 minute?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So we'll take a few discussion questions.
Okay, so one question is regarding to thinking outside the bias box. Do you know of any checklist that exists in order to help prompt people with what are all the different things they should be thinking about when thinking outside the box?
So that list of biases could be a checklist where you say, here's a problem and here's the way I'm thinking about it. And am I applying any of these biases to it? So this really has, in research and creativity thinking, this really has to be an explicit process where you examine, okay, so what are my assumptions here? Should I re-examine any of my assumptions? And this is a way to categorize some biases you might have in terms of your assumptions.
I see. Okay, got it. And Shazeen has the other question. So maybe Shazeen, you can ask it yourself.
Yes. Hi, Kathryn. This is Shazeen from AMD Research. So a question, it is great that you're talking about bias. And one of the bias that students often have to overcome is what you see is all there is, which often hits them with unfavorable and surprising reviews, paper reviews to be more precise. And any suggestions on overcoming that bias, which sort of reduces, the amount of surprise they have when they see their paper reviews?
So are you saying that you miss some important related work? I'm not sure what you mean by what you see is what you get.
Oh, what you see is all there is, which is, what I'm trying to say there is often we see a question from the reviewer, which let's say we did not think of, and which is surprising to us, which means that in our analysis of our design, we did not think about that. Okay. And the reason that happens is we think about our design in a box. We are like, okay, this is what it is, and there is nothing other than what I'm seeing, which leads to these surprising reviews. So I'm asking how to overcome that bias.
So one of the things is trying to pose hypotheses about the results you're seeing. So for instance, you could say, I believe this is happening because cash misses are reduced. And like I can measure that and show you that this is part of the explanation. But then you can measure that and you can find out, oh, that's not the explanation. It's the TLB misses or whatever. So having this alternative hypotheses about why your results might be true is one way to avoid reviewer surprise and then to try to evaluate what each hypothesis. But it's great that some reviewers have a better idea than you on occasion. Like that just shows you're posing an interesting problem that inspired them to think in a different way. It doesn't mean that you should have thought of that yourself. So give yourself a little bit of break there. Okay, so does someone have something that in the comments that is about the reflection? Like what was an overcoming bias a factor in anyone's creativity?
Unfortunately, we didn't get any attendee responses on that, Kathryn.
Okay.
I guess everybody feel free to speak up. Like this workshop is for you. So the more you participate and speak up, the more you'll take out of the event. Okay.
So for number 2, this is something that I suffer from, is I have a list of things to do. And some things are super hard and I don't know how, like what I'm gonna do. I don't have an idea about what to do next. And so I do useful procrastination. I always have more stuff to do than I cannot actually do. So I do the things that I actually know how to do. Like I have a really clear idea that, or like doing homework. I've done millions of homework problems. So I do that instead of working on something that's much harder and developing new skills. And so that's one of the things that I try to do to force myself at least to spend some time on the things that are harder. And sometimes this useful procrastination where you get started and you start thinking about it before you start doing it. All right, since I only have, since I've spent a lot of time on the front of the talk and we got started late, I'm gonna move on.
So,
all right.
Kathryn,
so,
one quick thing. A couple of responses have come in now. Do you want to take them now or do you want to take them later? Okay.
Thank you.
So Shazeen, do you want to?
Yeah, sorry to again hog. One of your first questions, Kathryn, was overcoming bias a factor in your creativity? The one thing I could think of there was, I often ask myself, what is it that I'm not looking at? You often, once we decide on a solution, often want to think about, again, in that box. And one way I go about it is, what is it that I'm not looking at? What is outside the box that I am in? Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't, but it's a question I ask.
That's great. That's a good example.
And we also have another example from Money. So Money, do you want to speak up?
Why don't you just read what Mani wrote?
Yeah, so they don't have a mic apparently. So what Money is saying is that learning a new skill is a challenge, and so as a priority, like they're not able to. Okay, I guess it's a long message. So to summarize what they're saying that one of the circumstances that holds them back is the lack of appropriate skills to solve their current research problem. So sometimes they do end up having to learn a lot of other things, which slows them down. I guess they were trying to answer the second question.
So learning new research skills slows you down when you're learning them, but then it speeds you up later on. So and then one of the things that I did as a senior professor was partnering with people who had different expertise than I did, so I could learn about how they approach problems and learn their techniques and expertise. So I don't have to learn it all myself, but I'm learning from an expert, or learning together with my student to develop some new skills in some new areas, so that we could, like I could do, one of my students did a bunch of proofs in her thesis, and so I learned a lot. I don't think I ever became really useful to her, but I learned a lot by reading carefully all those proofs and providing feedback. So that slows you down when you're doing it, but then you have a new muscle and a new approach to apply to problems. All right, so we're gonna go on. So right now, now we're going to talk more about emotional responses to problems. So one of the things that happens is all these different events in your life. So right now we're in an unprecedented world event where I've been working from home. I live in Seattle for 2 weeks. I read coronavirus and I find it very upsetting. And am I doing the right thing? Should I go outside? I don't have a face mask. They told us we shouldn't wear a face mask, but really face masks are protecting you, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so I have family and friends, and they go through ups and downs. Even though I've been married 35 years, my relationship with my husband isn't perfect yet, unfortunately. And so we have our ups and downs. My own health goes up and down, as well as the health of the world around me. And there are real good events in my life, and there are real bad events in my life, and how I manage my response to them. Like, if you can't predict how you're going to respond to coronavirus, okay? Because you can't even imagine that it would happen, although the other scientists have imagined it. So what I'm going to say is, research life, however, is very predictable. And there are a bunch of things that are going to happen to you. And you can learn about yourself from these predictable things and create models for reacting to these less predictable things. All right? And this is all about managing your emotional response when good and bad things happen. So here are things that will definitely happen to you as a researcher. You're going to have some ideas. You're going to work on those ideas. You're going to discuss them. You're going to write them up. You're going to submit papers. You're going to give a talk or teach a class. You're going to get feedback informally or formally, and you're going to and that feedback will be positive and negative. And you'll give good talks and bad talks. You'll get papers accepted and rejected. So you can predict that not everything that you'll do will work out. Okay? And you should be prepared that sometimes it won't work out. And you should have a response that you know how to do what you're going to do in response to one of these things happening. Okay, so now since I'm running a little short on time, we're going to have 30 seconds to write down a recent positive event that happened to you in your research life and what your feelings were about it. Go. And why you thought that positive event happened. Now do the same thing for a negative event. Okay, so this exercise, which we don't have time to do discussion on now, is your explanatory style, all right? And how you view both when positive things happen to you and how you view when negative things happen to you. How you explain that to yourself is talks about whether you have a positive, optimistic mindset or you have a pessimistic mindset. So the research shows that being more optimistic is helpful to success in life. Okay, and so like the keeping positive message is, I will learn and execute strategies to overcome failures and obstacles. And then I will learn and execute emotional resiliency strategies to manage my self in times of stress and failure. And so my example of we're in a time of stress, like staying home, having COVID virus, and all these people getting sick, and maybe someone close to you being in one of these categories of potentially very sick or at risk. So that's super stressful. And so but if you know what helps you cope with stress, so for example, for me, exercise. So I didn't exercise a couple of days last week. I felt really bad, and I'm like, okay, even though it's super boring and I don't like exercising at home on the bicycle, I better do it anyway. I much prefer going to my exercise class with all the people that I enjoy seeing at exercise class and doing it with people, but I can't do that right now. So I have to execute an emotional resilience strategy so I can stay positive and do a good job on this talk. So we're going to briefly go through what's optimism and pessimism in terms of a style of explaining things. And then, of course, this talk is optimism can be learned. And optimism is a little bit of a biased view of reality. And so is optimism always the better choice? Kind of the bottom line here is there's realistic optimism. And so that's what this research on mindset tells us. And this is an old research theory about 30 years, and it underpins what's now called the growth mindset. So what is defining pessimism or optimism is your explanatory style. And that's permanence. That's did the good event or the bad event, the good event or the bad event, is that permanent in time? Does it have a permanent underpinning? Is it pervasive? That is the circumstances surrounding that unchangeable or changeable? And then were you responsible or not? Okay, so when you explain yourself, that we don't have time for, I was way too optimistic on how many exercises we were gonna do. I explained by trying to stuff too much into this talk, but you can do this exercise later. Is your paper gets accepted or your paper gets rejected, how you explain either of these events goes to whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. Not just how you respond to negative events, but how also you explain positive events. So quickly going through the permanence is when something good happens to you and you're an optimist, then you think they have permanent causes. Like my paper got in because I know how to do research and I'm a good researcher, and that may be true or not true, but you view that it's a permanent cause. Bad events have temporary causes specific to the situation. Oh, these reviewers didn't read my paper carefully enough, or if I just fix the intro, then they'll understand the paper perfectly and my paper will get in. All right, so the pessimistic view of time is good events have temporary causes. So when my paper gets in, I view it, oh, I just got lucky. The reviewing process is random and I'm super lucky that my paper got in. Or or if my paper gets rejected, explaining that, oh, the whole process is broken, and I don't, and so like submitting papers, it's just a crapshoot, so it doesn't matter what you do. If you work hard or not, it won't get in, all right? And so those explanations can basically have similar root causes, but they cause you to be passive, all right? So, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later. If you view that bad events are temporary and specific to the situation, then that's something you can change. If you view that bad events have permanent causes, like you don't trust the reviewing system, then there's no hope for you to make your paper better and your research better for it to get in. You're paralyzed by not being able to address that. So bringing the this is temporary, I can fix that, causes you to act more. So in pervasiveness, that this is similar, but this is context versus can you change the system versus whether this is a time. And so if you have a good event, like your paper gets in, then you want to say, not only do I know what I'm doing, like, or I worked hard on this paper and I'm a good researcher, but that the process is a good process. And so, and that'll persist over time. And so those factors make me trust in the research process. And so I want to keep doing it. Or if, again, these bad events are the circumstances, luck, others. And this is very similar, but it's more about the context than the specific event. And then personalization. So I have a link to taking a test where you're a pessimist or an optimist. And on some aspects, on the explanatory space and time, I'm good, but on personalization, I'm really bad, actually. I'm very pessimistic. So that's something for me to work on. I believe bad events are caused by me because I'm not enough and I should do better. All right? Instead of thinking that, oh, bad events are more caused by circumstance or luck or others. And the truth is usually somewhere in the middle, not just you or someone else, but I tend to personalize things a little bit too much. So that's another way in which optimists and pessimists differ. So if you are a pessimist, kind of you believe this bad event will last a long time, it undermines everything I'm doing, and it's all my own fault, all right? And so if you have all three of these things, then you're producing kind of a passive approach to, and your action is futile, okay? And I obviously, you've seen me make lots of changes in the community in terms of double-blind reviewing and something. I'm definitely an optimist and believe that if I make different actions, that they can change the circumstances. But I also take a lot of personal responsibility, and sometimes it's not my own fault. So in the optimistic style, it's a temporary setback, it's this one event, it's not my fault, it's other people, bad luck, and so I can make big changes. So you can be deluded, it's never your fault. You can't say that optimism is always positive in all situations. So what's called flexible optimism is this mix of what can happen. So success is not always favoring the most talented, but the adequately talented that are also optimists. So I feel this explains myself because I failed my qualifying exams, and so I always feel like, and I wasn't the starest student in my group at grad school, but I've always feel like I was adequately talented, and I had this very optimistic, very active mindset that I could make a difference, and try very hard. So that's so as I look back on my own career, I feel that this has really helped me quite a bit. So then the idea was you had these things, and then you get a little flavor of whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. but we're not going to have time to do that because I do want to leave a few more minutes for questions, even though we started late. So the next layer of this model is what's called a fixed versus a growth mindset. So, so you'll notice I said there were lots of people who were more brilliant than I was and passed their qualifying exams, for instance, on the first try. And so you could say that I'm not smart enough, but it's never an instant. Like, even if you have a smart kindergartner, that like they have a long way to go. And it's not a permanent property. Like, just because you're a good kindergartner, a smart kindergartner, doesn't mean you're going to be a great college student. There's a lot of learning that goes on. So these fixed so telling yourself you have a fixed property rather than you have the ability to learn and grow and go deep and find new skill sets, that's a super important property of yourself that you need to say isn't fixed, but rather all these things are growing. And I want to focus on a lot of what I've talked about is emotional resilience, and this growth mindset is also applied to how you manage your emotions and how you are you sensitive to the other people around you, and are you fun to work with, and are you a good leader? That these things are not just static properties. These are things you have to work on all the time, right? So I knew I was never going to get to that one. So that was just a summary. And I encourage you to pick the things that you want to work on and find something that's most interesting to you or you feel like is holding you back the most, and then write stuff down and then make sure you do it. So for example, on my leadership journey, I haven't had bosses before. I worked for Google. As a professor, really, your own boss, and you don't have to manage up the corporate food chain. And so I don't do that very well yet. And so that's the area that I'm currently working on myself. So here are my 4 things that I suggest you focus on having this as your mindset, and then how you apply them to each of these research events, and have strategies for good and bad things happening on each of these events so you can manage your emotions, but also when they happen, you can learn from them and improve over them. And this is a lot. So I suggest you just pick 1 or 2 things and work on those. And then once you feel you've improved that muscle, choose something else. And so I'm doing this all the time, especially in my journey at Google, to be a more scalable leader. I was very good at leading where I had close personal relationships with my students. I enjoyed working with students. Most of my students still like me. So I had a lot of success both in their research, getting them to do good research, but also in enjoyable relationships. So here's a lot of the material today comes from these Martin Siegelman's Learned Optimism, that part there, and that questionnaire I told you where I'm a little pessimistic on myself. Well, the good and bad thing about that, it's always my fault when things go wrong. It's always my fault when things go well. Like, that gives you agency, at least. And so understanding yourself. And so these are some resources. And this whole talk was inspired by Samuel Kunev's course notes, where he teaches a bunch of this material, and he does it in 3 hours instead of in 55 minutes. So now we have, if you can stay for 5 more minutes, is that okay?
Yeah, that's totally fine, yes.
Okay, so now I'll take more questions. Thank you very much. And there on the slide deck is on the web, on my personal UT webpage, where I still have it, and you can look at these homework problems, and there'll be a video of this talk.
Yes. And the slides are also up on the workshop website if somebody wants to access.
Great.
So, so Kathryn, there are a few questions. So one question is, what is your advice to PhD students who get stuck in a research direction?
Well, that is bias, right? And so that is, you have to explicitly think outside the box. So you can be stuck because your advisor thinks this is the right area and you just haven't figured it out. Or you can be stuck because you're not coming up with ideas. So maybe you work. One of the strategies I've used in my life is I'm not having any ideas in this area that I want to work in. So where do I have some good ideas? And I often read the literature to generate new ideas. What I think is wrong with this paper often generates an idea on what's right. So at UW, they have a model where you always should be working on 2 papers. So if you're stuck on one, maybe the other one is going well, and they should be separate topics, and you always have 2 advisors with different points of view. And that is a structural, systematic way to keep that one thing from sticking you and discouraging you.
Okay. The next question is regarding implementation effort. Sometimes you have ideas, but you don't know if these are good ideas or not. But when you try to implement these ideas, then you know that there is a lot of implementation effort ahead of you, and that can cause its own stress. So how would one deal with that?
So one of the ways to prove an idea is worth going after is to have a best case scenario. So let's say you remove all the cache misses with this new approach. How much does that speed up the program? So having an upper bound analysis before you get started on an idea, on something that's going to clearly take quite a bit of implementation effort, can help keep you motivated and directed towards the problem. So if you find, oh, it doesn't matter how well my implementation works, there's only 2% to get here, then it's not worth going after. And this is something we use in industry and in research all the time, which is understand the scope of the effort you're going after. So this works really well for things like performance and how many resources you use. It works less well for things like trying to make a more productive programming language, okay? Because then you have to measure that on human beings, and that's much harder to do. So some of the qualitative aspects of research are really favored by these upper bound, lower bound things, quantitative, while these qualitative aspects, simplifying or making things work better for human beings, are a bit harder to quantify, but still, like you can say, it took somebody this long to do this programming task, and now we're going to do it in fewer lines of code or faster. So you can do estimates on those less easily quantified things as well.
I see. And the next question is on how to give oneself hard deadlines and stick to those deadlines. First of all, do you recommend such a strategy? If you do, then how do you think one should go about implementing that strategy?
So paper deadlines are great, hard deadlines, and I felt that this always motivated and helped people work towards a goal, because, but although missing that goal can be discouraging. So I think they're good, but when you're 2 weeks out or 3 weeks out, you need to reprioritize or have very well prioritized the things that have to be there versus the things that are nice to be there. So these hard deadlines are good, but where you have to have is the flexibility of what's the minimal possible unit that makes this a complete task? And then what are the other things that can support it and would be nice, but we could leave to after the deadline and put in the revised version or whatever if you're working towards a paper deadline. And so you have to have, in order to set a hard deadline, you have to have a realistic estimate of what you can get done and be making progress on that. And these things, like if you're doing, back to the previous question, if something you're doing has a lot of implementation work, setting yourself minor goals for this part of it, I'm going to do this week. This should take me half a day. This should take me 3 days. And then writing those things down and seeing how well you're estimating things can help you be much better at understanding how long things will really take you.
I see. Got it. The next question is on what are your thoughts about a person who is optimistic about bad events, but somewhat pessimistic about good events? So this is like an optimistic person with imposter syndrome, for example.
Well, so you need to examine, like wherever you sit on this spectrum, it's useful to understand your personal point of view, and then where it's keeping you from acting is the important thing. So if we go back here to the advantage of this optimistic explanatory style is it produces action, that you try harder and that you view defeat or things going wrong as a challenge. Like you can view working from home as a challenge, okay? So I did a bunch, like just not seeing people, just sitting in my office where I wasn't used to sitting all day long, right? So I bought myself some flowers to make my office happier. I got all the crap off the floor this weekend and put it in little files. So I did things to create an atmosphere where I felt happier. So here, the challenge is working from home, having a new office. I found my back was hurting, so I lifted my little stand where I should be looking into the camera instead of looking at the people's faces. That you have to act, right? And so wherever your pessimism is keeping you from acting is where the problem is. It's not whether you. It's like, it's the result, not the actual view, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then wherever you feel that you're like, I'll never get, all the paper stuff is rigged, I don't even want to submit another paper. I've seen students get into that mode. Like in my experience, really good papers always get in. Mm-hmm. Papers that have different strengths and weaknesses, it depends on the reviewer because they have a different value system. And that's okay that we have a variety of scientific value systems. And you know, like, you get lucky, you find the reviewers with the same value system you do. But what's even better is even reviewers with a different value system than you do on what's most important or most interesting, you can explain your paper well enough that they'll also let it get in. So these kind of mindsets around the processes and if they're fair and what you need to do to counter them is super important for staying motivated and participating in the research community. And so if your thoughts are negative and keeping you from participating and change and being happy, then like, maybe you don't need to be a researcher, maybe you should come to industry and not submit papers, but you're still gonna have failures in industry. Your code's still not gonna work. People are still gonna give you negative feedback that you weren't personable enough, that your leadership style was too pushy. Like that was feedback I got recently. So it's just gonna be different negative events and you're still gonna have to manage your emotions and understand how to act. The advantage of a research career is the events are predictable, right? You know you submitted the paper, you know your idea, and you can do it yourself versus having other people tell you. Like I gave a bad lecture at school, having all those students like wrinkle up their foreheads and like look like you're an idiot. Like you don't need somebody writing anything down. You have immediate feedback that's informal, and so you can improve yourself so that you feel better. And these things don't happen, and you have to, or they happen. Not that they don't happen; they happen less, right? So that, and then you get in this virtual cycle of, oh, now I can give a good talk. And if I give a bad talk, it's because I didn't prepare enough. Or if I give a talk like today, which had too much information in, the first time you give it, like now I know how to simplify this talk or maybe separate it into 2 parts or something, right?
Yes, okay. And moving on to the last question, what is your advice to some student who knows that their research would be better with more collaboration, but their supervisor is not in favor of collaboration, for example?
Well, you have to work with, you have to find a good set of collaborators and reasons to collaborate. So you could just try to explore why your advisor doesn't want to do the collaboration. So you can say, I think working with X who has expertise in Y would really make this work better. What do you think? Right? Instead of, and do an open-ended question so you try to get to their root motivations, right? And so maybe they just don't, maybe they have a really good reason. They try to collaborate with this person before and the person doesn't do their part. Like they come to meetings, but they don't write any of the paper. And so they have a limited, like your advisor could have a really good reason for not wanting to work with this person. I have people I don't want to work with because our working styles are incompatible, or I feel like the person doesn't match the effort, or whatever, like some variety of real good reasons for not working with people. Or you try it out. Like maybe they just, and maybe you can go work with the person and meet with that person and get advice from them without making a full-blown collaboration on the certain project. So you can get their expertise without making them co-author, for instance.
Good. Okay, I think that is all the questions we have, Kathryn. So thanks for taking the time and speaking with us today. And thanks for the lovely presentation. I think it will be useful for a lot of students. And like I said, we have both the slides up on the website, and pretty soon we'll have the recording up on the website as well. Okay, thanks, Kathryn.
Thanks so much. It was really my honor to get to talk to all of you, and I wish you a lot of success in your life in managing the coronavirus and in your research life in managing the ups and downs of research.